Welcome to Project Command. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and I'll be your host. On today's episode, we're going to talk all about how to track metrics on your project and how to measure progress. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, it really helps us if you follow, leave a 5-star review, or share this episode or any episode you liked with a friend. Remember that every share helps more fire service professionals learn the skills and mindset to deliver stronger, smarter projects. All right, let's get to the episode. So guys, this is an episode I've been looking forward to and been a little intimidated by, to be totally honest with you. And the reason for that is that tracking metrics on a project is both one of the most important things that you can do and also one of the most challenging. And we're going to talk about why that is throughout the course of this episode. And hopefully we're going to address some of the misunderstandings and friction points that go along with measuring metrics on a project, and hopefully make it seem like it's a little bit more approachable. So with that in mind, the way I want to frame this episode today is with the old who, what, when, where, and how of project metrics. So I'm going to go through all those different categories and we'll talk about all the different elements of collecting metrics. So before we get into all of that though, I want to talk about two things. The first is some of the myths around metrics, and the second is how we can measure projects ethically. So firstly, let's talk about some of the myths that there are about project metrics. And the first one that I want to talk about is that there is a belief that all metrics have to be hyper-specific and fully objective, backed up by dashboards and graphs and troves of data. And that's not usually the case. Now, there are some times when it's really important that we track things very specifically. That's typically around things like compliance or maybe even technology rollouts. But generally speaking, the reason that we're measuring things, and we'll get into this in the why of project metrics, but usually when we're tracking things, we don't need things to be hyper specific because we're just using that information to provide updates and keep people in the loop on how things are going and just figure out if we're moving in the right direction. And so for that reason, it doesn't matter if things are exactly 100% totally correct. You want them to be right, but you don't need them to be hyper specific. And we don't need to be obsessed with things being totally objective. The other alternative being subjective metrics, which of course we'll talk about. And, just remember that when we collect these metrics, it's not like we're turning this over to the IRS and they're going to audit all of our metrics. And if anything is wrong, we have to pay a fine. It's nothing like that. So just remember that it's okay to use subjective data. And again, we'll get way deeper into this, but it's okay to use subjective data. And just have a good balance of objective and subjective. Okay, now let's talk about what it means to measure projects ethically. Now, the reason I like to include this is because I think this is something that unfortunately tends to happen more than maybe we'd like it to. And what I'm referring to is how we can use metrics and data to to tell a story that isn't accurate. And so typically what this means is cherry picking the metrics. So, let's say, for example, we're tracking 5 things and 3 of them get worse and 2 of them get better. But we only really focus on the 2 that got better and we kind of just pretend that the 3 that got worse just like aren't even there, or, we just don't talk about them. And that's tempting to kind of highlight the things like, oh, look at these 2 things. They show that, things are going so well. And it's tempting to do that, but it doesn't really paint an accurate picture. And it's not really an ethical way to tell either your project sponsor or your stakeholders or your project team, sort of the people that we're giving this information to. It's not an accurate way to convey how the project is going. And so it's really important that if we're collecting data, we want to be transparent about all the data that we're collecting, not just the stuff that makes us look good. And another thing, we really need to pick the metrics that we're going to measure at the beginning of a project. Think about it like this. Imagine I had I'm trying to get healthy. I'm trying to get into better shape. And, 3 months goes by and let's say I've gained weight and my blood pressure is up, but, maybe I'm sleeping better. So I think to myself, all right, well, let me pick the metrics that I'm going to measure here. How about sleep? Well, my sleep is better, therefore I've been successful. And that's kind of the risk you run into when we pick our metrics either middle of the way through the project or towards the end. We tend to just pick the metrics that show what we want it to show, instead of metrics that actually tell the full and complete story. So we want to pick the things that we're going to measure at the beginning of a project and stick to them. Hey, we're going to measure weight, we're going to measure blood pressure, and we're going to measure sleep. So these are just a couple things to think about because, really data and metrics are only as good as how much people trust them. And so if we selectively put information out there or we kind of cherry pick what things we want to measure and track or what we want to communicate that we've been measuring, we're going to erode the trust in that data and those metrics, and eventually that data is just going to become meaningless or at the very least less relevant. So it's really important to kind of at the outset discuss what it means to ethically track metrics for a project. Okay, so with that said, let's get into the who of project metrics. So what I mean by this is who needs to be collecting these metrics. And just like with ICS, if the incident commander doesn't delegate a function, they own it. And it's the same on projects. If the project manager doesn't delegate collecting these metrics, that means that the project manager owns it. And so, who can we delegate to? Well, you can delegate this to an assistant project manager, somebody on the team, or even potentially a stakeholder. But generally, the difference in my mind between a project team member and a stakeholder is stakeholders you can't assign work to, and project team members you can assign work to. So I guess with that being said, you really are going to either give it to a project team member or maybe an assistant project manager. And it's important to identify who's going to be collecting these metrics because just like with all work, if you don't assign somebody to it, it's probably not going to get done. So it's really important to assign an owner. And a lot of times what I like to do is I'll design the metrics and then I will delegate it to somebody. So a good example I can think of is, probably about a year and a half ago, we did a project to roll out Bluetooth functionality between our SCBAs and our Motorola radios. And after we rolled this out, I had one of the guys on our project team do a quality audit where I identified, hey, I want you to check to make sure that when we turn the air pack in the radio on, it pairs within 30 seconds. I want you to check to make sure that, the designated radio that you're checking can be, the audio is good and can be clearly understood by dispatch. And then I want you to ask these 3 basic questions to whoever is riding in that seat that you're checking for the day, to test their basic understanding of the system. And those are the 3 things that I want you to go out and track or collect information on. And so I'll design it and I'll write, here's how you do this, and here's what we're looking for you to collect, and here's where I want you to collect it. And then I'll assign it to somebody. And so in that case, that person would be collecting the data, but they would be doing it with some guidance that I've provided, because a lot of times that can be really intimidating to figure out what to track. So anyways, that's kind of the who of it. And the thing to remember there is it's you, the project manager, unless you delegate it to somebody else. All right. So let's talk about what are we going to measure. Now, the way I like to look at this is there are 4 categories of things that we're going to measure. The first we could just generally refer to as resource utilization. And things that would fall into this category are things like how many materials are we using, vendors, like anything involving a vendor, any of the equipment we're using, or personnel. Like, this project team member is working on 3 different tasks. This one's working on 2 different tasks. Or, if you're using equipment, how much is that piece of equipment being used? Or materials. How many of these materials do we have left? So maybe your project was to put on a forcible entry class, and one of the materials you're keeping track of is how many wooden dowels you have for the forcible entry simulator. So that'd be an example of a material that you're tracking. Things that you would track with a vendor are, just tracking the progress of a vendor's task. So, if a vendor is supposed to set up a system for you and they say that it'll take a month, that might be something that we would track. And with personnel, again, it's just how many things they're working on or how many things they're completing. And this is where things like what's called a WIP limit come into play. And a WIP limit is work in progress. And sometimes this can be a really good thing for a project manager to track because it allows you to make sure that nobody on your team is getting overloaded with work. So you might set what's called a WIP limit as the project manager, and you might say the WIP limit is 2 tasks, meaning a work in progress limit is 2 tasks. I'm not going to let anybody on my team be assigned more than 2 things at a time to keep them from being overloaded and overwhelmed. So that might be something that you track there. The second category is cost and time. Now, this is a pretty straightforward one, at least conceptually. And these are things like our budget versus our actual, meaning this is how much we said we were going to spend, and this is how much we're actually spending. So, like I'm thinking back on a project I did recently to provide CPR training to all of our school security officers. And one of the things I did was I identified how much overtime I was going to be using per session. So I would say, okay, this session, I'm going to have 3 firefighters working for 4 hours each. So 3 times 4 is 12. So I plan on spending 12 hours of overtime per session. And then I would go back and look and I would say, okay, well, actually, it took 16 hours of overtime here. So I was 4 hours over. So that'd be an example of how I might track the budget versus the actual. And that also kind of talks about how you track labor hours and a schedule variance kind of stuff. And by schedule variance, what I'm talking about is I said I would have this piece of work done by this date. Did I do it, or is it taking longer, or did it take shorter? So those are things that we would track that relate to cost and time. Now, the third category is work and progress. So this is things like how many tasks have been completed. So I've talked about this many times on the podcast, but what I like to do is, you collect your requirements from all your different stakeholders, you put those requirements together, and the requirements are all of the individual things that your project has to do. So you put your list of requirements together, you use that to make your scope, and then you take that scope and you decompose it into an activities list, which are bite-sized activities that you can hand off to a team. And so one of the things you might track is how many of those bite-sized activities or tasks are being completed, how many objectives are being achieved. You can also look at milestones that you're hitting. And to kind of refresh your memory, milestones are, you think about milestones like they're chapters in a book. So if you took a project and you were to write a book about a project, the milestones would be the chapters. Chapter 1, you build the project team, develop the scope. That's a milestone. The next milestone might be adequately identify all the different elements of the work breakdown structure and assign work and develop the schedule. That might be a milestone. So just like the different chunks of work along the way. And lastly, the last category of things that you might want to track, the what of project metrics, is risk. Now, we could talk a lot about risk. We could do a whole episode on risk, and I will do a whole episode on risk. But for now, I want to just leave you with this little gem that I use all the time when I talk about tracking risk. And that is what's called a risk score. All right. So let's say you're sitting with all your project team members and your stakeholders, and you're trying to identify, hey, what are the risks that we face during this project? Maybe it's things like budget overruns, resource deficits, like, hey, we're not going to have enough people to do this, or, the technology we buy from the vendor isn't going to be as advertised, or we might not get it done in time. These are all examples of risks. And if we wanted to score those risks to figure out, hey, what are the biggest risks that we face? This is how I like to do it. You're going to take 2 different things, probability and impact. Probability, obviously, is how likely is this risk to happen, 1 to 10. So how likely is a budget overrun? Well, maybe that's a 3 out of 10 likely. Okay. Now let's look at the impact. Impact is how big of a deal is it if this happens? So how big of a deal is it if you have a budget overrun? Well, how likely are you to be able to get more money? And depending on the answer to that, you would figure out maybe it's a five, a five out of the on the 1 to 10 impact score. So our probability is a 3 out of 10, and our impact is a 5 out of 10. Now we're going to multiply 3 times 5, and that gives us 15. So the risk score for budget overruns is 15. And we'll do this for all the risks, and we'll score them. How likely is it, 1 to 10, and how big of a deal is it, 1 to 10? Now times them by each other, and that's their score. And so every risk gets a score, and that allows us to figure out, hey, these are the highest scoring risks. That means these are the ones we're really going to keep an eye on. So this is just a way for you to track your risk throughout the project. And remember that risk changes. Something that might seem like a high risk in the beginning, like, hey, this seems like it's going to really, it's got a high probability. Maybe as the project goes on, you realize that probability is a lot lower than you thought, or maybe the impact is a lot lower than you thought, or higher. So risk is something we want to keep our eye on and track sometimes because these things change throughout the course of the project. Okay, now let's move on to when. When do we track metrics? And guys, this one's pretty straightforward. We track metrics. First we identify our metrics at the beginning. We talked about that. You want to identify what are we going to track at the beginning. So, if you're rolling out new equipment, let's figure out, hey, what do we need to track? Well, we need to track, did the equipment end up where it was supposed to go? And do the people that we delivered the equipment to know how to use it? That's how we would measure success on that. Okay, well, that's what we want to track. Now, when are we going to track that? Well, I like to just, for simplicity's sake, you want to track throughout the entire course of the project. But to dial that in a little bit more, as soon as you start executing work, you need to start tracking work. So recall that the PMI, or Project Management Institute, says that there are 5 stages to a project. Okay, there's initiation, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, which is what we're talking about, and closing. But the executing phase and the monitoring and controlling phase happen simultaneously. So as soon as you start executing, you start measuring. But even more specifically than that, you're going to want to check these metrics before you provide updates. So my favorite thing to track is if I have, 5 things I've assigned to people, I'll call those people. Let's say I provide my updates on a Tuesday. I'll call them on a Monday and I'll say, hey man, I assigned you the document review. What % done are you with that document review? And they might say, I'm 60% done with it. Okay, that's an example of a subjective metric. But that's a very useful subjective metric because if I call that person a week later and I say, hey man, you were 60% done with this document review last week, where do you think you are this week? If they say, man, I probably am at a 65, I don't think I've gotten much done. Okay, still a subjective metric, but it tells me a lot. It tells me they don't think they're getting that much work done. Versus maybe they said they were at a 30 last week and this week they're at an 80. Okay, well, what if that 80 is actually 70 or 75? Is that big of a deal? No, not really, because what I need to know is you were at 30 last week, where are you this week? Man, I'm at an 80 or 75 or whatever. Okay, great, that's a lot of progress. So that's what I want to know with that kind of a metric. And so I would check that before I provide those updates. And anytime I have a big meeting with my executive leadership team or the project sponsor, which again is the person that authorized the work, I might want to check in on those metrics just to get a sense of where we're at. And another thing that would kind of drive me to check those metrics is maybe if I'm getting ready to make a big decision on a project and I want to make that decision with some good data to support it. That might be a time to kind of dig into my numbers, dig into my metrics, and try to get a sense of where the project is. And one last thing about that, when we track metrics, we always want to document this somewhere. Don't just have it in the back of your head. Oh, this is at a 70%, we're good. You want to keep track of this stuff, so write it down. And that's going to be really relevant at the end of the project, particularly because when you put together your project closeout report and when you end a project the right way, you want to have all those metrics and numbers written down so that you can tell an accurate, comprehensive story at the end of the project. Okay. Which is a good segue into where metrics are used and seen and kept. So remember that metrics exist to inform people. And so with that in mind, the where is in updates that we provide to our project team and to our stakeholders. So I'm thinking specifically now about, I like to provide I create a document, an update that I provide to everybody. And so I have a standard document that I use, which, by the way, if anybody wants any of the documentation that I talk about on the podcast, feel free to email us at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. And I'm happy to share any of the documents I use with anybody. So feel free to send us an email. But when I put that update together, my standardized update template, I will put the metrics in there. And I will also keep track of it on my project management plan, which is my single source where I keep all my documents and all my metrics and all my updates. I keep all of those together in a project management plan. And that's where I will keep them. And as far as where you can see these metrics, the update is a good place for it. But also, sometimes you'll have a dashboard either that you created because you're great with data, or if you're using something like Microsoft Teams, it automatically will create a dashboard for you. If you're utilizing the Teams format to run a project, using the buckets and all that sort of stuff, you can click on the data and it'll automatically show you you've assigned this many tasks to this person and to this person and to this person. And these are how many have been marked complete. These are how many are in progress, and on and on. So just a great way to kind of get like an easy dashboard if you're using Microsoft Teams. Okay. Now, why do we track metrics? Now, really, there are 3 reasons that we track metrics. And this is really important because understanding why we're tracking these metrics can help us figure out what we want to track. So, the first reason that we collect metrics is to inform. So, specifically, we want to inform our team, our stakeholder, our project sponsor, and our department leadership. And so knowing that we want to inform them will dictate what we track. That's why I really like tracking the percent complete, because that's a great way to keep everybody in the loop. Hey guys, these are the 5 things we're working on. This one is 70% done. This one's 10% done. This one's 95% done. And this one's 50% done. That gives people a really good kind of 30,000 foot view of where a project is. And then the next week, they look at that and they say, okay, well, now these have moved, in this direction. And so, now I know how these tasks are progressing. Okay, another reason we track metrics is to track our progress. So what I mean by that is, are we moving towards our objective at an appropriate speed? And this is really critical. A lot of times if you have a deadline for a project, and this, like, I can think of a bunch of examples, but hey, we got to get this. Look, so here's an example. I'm working on a project right now, a 508 compliance project, where we have to get all of our forward-facing information to be compliant with the 508 requirements, which is for people with disabilities. So things like captions and colors and all that. And so we have deadlines that we need to meet for that. And so I want to keep track of how quickly we're getting things done to, be able to see, hey, are we on track to meet our deadlines here? And so that's when you would want to track the progress of stuff. Are we drifting, or is what's called our project velocity decreasing? So maybe, hey, last month we got this much done. This month we're not getting that much done. And that can be a red flag. Hey, why are we getting so much less work done this month versus last month? And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe you need more resources. Maybe the work is especially challenging. Maybe there's a misunderstanding of how to do the work, or possibly maybe technical debt is accumulating, meaning things that we thought were done aren't actually done. And they're just like kind of done enough that we feel like they're done, but work is still sneaking in from those tasks because they're not all the way done. In which case, maybe you need to address some of your project's technical debt. So all of these are things that you can know and address if you're tracking your progress. And the last why of why we're tracking these metrics is to identify problems early, which is kind of what we were talking about with the progress. Hey, we're not getting as much work done. That could be a problem. Also, this is how we figure out if we have delays and bottlenecks or resource strain. Like, hey, we need more IT bandwidth, more IT hours, because we're not getting these things done quickly enough. So maybe we need to ask for help from our project sponsor and say, hey, we're going to need more IT support, or more, HR support, or whatever you need, more people from operations. And this is also how you're going to figure out if you need to escalate risks, things that, hey, we're tracking this and, it's not going in the right direction. And, this is a serious issue. So now I'm going to escalate this to my project sponsor or whoever I need to escalate it to to get a resolution. Remember, metrics are early warning systems, not autopsy reports, okay? We're using these to figure out when things go wrong before it's a huge deal, not after. Okay, now let's talk about how we track metrics. So remember that metrics tell a story, they're not a scoreboard, okay? So on some projects, success might look like, did we implement the system exactly as designed? Or maybe, did we meet a compliance or an accreditation requirement, like a deadline or something like that? On other projects, success might look like, are response times improving, staying the same, or getting worse after we, maybe change a response model? Or, maybe we reorganized how our drug box is set up. And so that might be, maybe now we're going to look at, are we administering medications faster on a cardiac arrest? And so the thing to remember about how to track metrics is you must first know exactly what you want the data to tell you. So to go back to my medication example, if we've done something with our drug box and we want to know, is this a good way to organize a drug box or not? That would lead us to say, okay, we need to track how quickly we're giving these drugs. And once we know, hey, we need to track how quickly we're giving these drugs, that will tell us how to do it. Okay, we want to track how quickly we're giving these drugs. How would we do that? Well, let's pull the call sheets and we can look, hey, on cardiac arrests, before we changed it, it took us 2 minutes to give the first epi. After we changed it, it took us 1.5 minutes to give the first epi. So understanding what we're tracking and why we're tracking it will very often tell us how we're going to track it. And this is probably a good time to drill down a little bit more on the difference between objective and subjective. So just very briefly, things that are objective metrics are things that are facts. These are numbers, data, charts, reports. And some examples of that would be things like dollars spent, hours logged, tasks completed, or specific risk scores. Versus subjective metrics, which are things like individual assessments. I'm this percent done, I'm this percent done. Team assessments, like maybe you have a team working on a task and you want to check in with the whole team. Things like perceived progress or even confidence levels. Maybe one of the tasks is, you need your team to learn how to use a system before they can complete the work. And so you track how confident they feel using that system, at the beginning of the training and then after the training to determine if the confidence is there to get it done. So those would be subjective, but very, very useful. And subjective metrics, I want you to think about this too. A lot of times we think of like objective metrics are where we get numbers and data from, but subjective metrics can still be numbers like percent complete or 1 out of 5, how confident you are. And just because they're subjective doesn't inherently mean that they're not valuable. There's a time and a place for subjective and objective metrics. And sometimes getting addicted to those objective metrics can rob us of some really good hows on how to collect those metrics. We'll think, oh, we can't use that because that's subjective. And so we'll skip over the data that could give us really valuable, actionable information. Like, for example, Bob was 50% complete last week, and now he's only 55% complete. That's a subjective metric, but it's extremely actionable. I need to dig in to figure out why Bob's not getting more work done. So that's a little bit about the how of project metrics. And, I think that this is as good a time as any to say that there are so many sort of standardized metrics out there, things like EVM, which is earned value management, or budget compliance, or things like that. And, if you want more information on those, this is something that ChatGPT or whatever your AI of choice is great at. You can say, hey, this is the project I'm working on, and I want to track this thing. I want to see, are people comfortable using this equipment? Or I want to track, are our response times getting better? Or I want to track, are we giving drugs faster? How can I track that? Ask it and say, here's the prompt I would use. ChatGPT, I want to track how quickly we're administering epinephrine on cardiac arrests. List 10 ways that I can track that specific piece of information. And then I would look through that list of 10 and I would pick 2 or 3 that look promising. And I would say, tell me more about these 2 or 3. and I would drill down until I feel comfortable with it, and that might be a good way to figure out how you want to collect some information. All right, I want to finish with a closing thought here. Remember that metrics don't exist to make your project look good. Metrics are not awards you give yourself or ways that you can just throw a couple of extra charts into a project closeout report to make it look more official. We collect metrics rather for a specific reason. And that reason is that they make our projects understandable. Because a lot of times on projects, people are going to ask you, "Hey, how's this project going?" Or, what's the progress or whatever. And we don't want to just kind of go with our gut feeling like, I think it's going well or I think it's going poorly. We want to be able to understand the project well enough to give good information. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is by tracking those metrics. So just remember that metrics don't exist to make your project look good. They exist to make your project understandable. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Project Command. If you enjoyed this episode, help us out by following us wherever you listen to podcasts and consider leaving us a 5-star review. It really, really helps. Also, consider sharing this episode with a friend. Remember that every share helps more fire service professionals learn the skills and mindset to deliver better projects. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and this has been Project Command, bringing command level thinking to every project in the fire service.